You're listening to the Nerd to Know Media Network. Join us at nerdtoknowmedia.com.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, it's now time for our main event. Take a trip back in time to the golden era of the wrestling world with your host, Chris Techrold Blade. Welcome to Once Upon a Turnbuckle.
For a recent feature here on Once Upon a Turnbuckle, I reached out into various Facebook groups of classic wrestling fans for fans who would be interested in appearing on the show, who may have seen some sort of major events, some key angles in wrestling history live in person to talk about them. The result was episode 13, which was codenamed the Facebook fans. It was the second part of my feature, I Was There When. And the three that I included in that episode, the three guys I spoke to, all their separate interviews were so great and so much fun. And besides the key points that I picked out of the interviews to put into that episode in particular, there was some other great stuff that came up in my conversations with them. So I decided that each of them really deserved to be released as an episode in their own right. So what you see in this 3-part feature is these interviews in full with these guys, and I'm hoping this will become more of a regular thing as well, because I realised how much fun it is to talk to fellow fans. So here we are, the Facebook fans Uncut feature. So in this one, the first part is my conversation with Andrew Lacelle. So enjoy.
I'm from St. John, New Brunswick, Canada. I currently live in Vancouver. And my first exposure to wrestling, I didn't realize what it was. I was flipping through the channels one morning and I saw on either Good Morning America or Today or one of those early daytime shows, it was Mr. T sitting there with someone who wasn't Hannibal Smith from the A-Team. And I thought, who's this guy? I was quite familiar with Mr. T, and the A-Team was my favorite show, but I didn't realize it was Hulk Hogan. He could have been Adam for all I know.
Wow.
And that was my first memory of anything wrestling. And then I remember vividly the LJN wrestling figures, seeing them at the stores. And I didn't really have any interest in them. They just looked like big hunks of rubber. And I didn't have any knowledge of who they were. They were just on the pegs, and I didn't care. And I remember asking my grandfather to bring me home like a He-Man figure, and he brought home Hulk Hogan, and I feigned interest. I was like, yay. And I opened it up and it had that new toy smell, and I thought, I can get behind this.
Nice. And
a couple of toys later, I remember getting Iron Sheik, and then I remember getting Andre the Giant. And we went to our cabin. This was shortly after the Santa Claus parade. And I remember I was playing with my Andre the Giant toy, and a friend of the family saw me playing with it, and he said, "Oh, I see you have Andre the Giant there." And I looked at him in total bewilderment, because I didn't know that these were based on real people. I thought it was like a G.I. Joe or He-Man or Marshall Bravestar. And as a young boy, the thing that I valued the most and the thing I always strived for was acceptance from an adult. So if an adult had an interest in my interest, I was all set. And I think that's really why a lot of boys get into sports, so that they can have that adult conversation with adult men. Yeah. And I'm the type of fellow that doesn't go into anything with half my buttocks. I use the whole ass. And I got really into the wrestling magazines, especially if the cover had someone bleeding. Okay. And I remember just being really hardcore into it almost immediately. I just remember reading about the history, having Bruno Sammartino be my favorite wrestler without ever having seen him, just from the fact that he had been the champion for so long.
Cool. Yeah.
And
it's really interesting sort of hearing that side of it from another fan. You know, I've spoken to other guys about how they got into the industry, but it's nice to hear from someone else. It's similar kind of thing with me. I discovered it through one of my cousins, and then once I knew what it was, that was it. I was there and I wanted everything. You know, and that was my childhood pretty much wrapped around that. So it's good to, there's something about wrestling, I think, which really does stay with you.
Oh, it creates lifelong bonds. Like two of my best friends, we bonded because of our mutual appreciation of professional wrestling. And I can't imagine that being like that with basketball, football, hockey, anything else, even movies, you know, or TV shows. It's just because it's too all encompassing. There's too many baseball fans to just say, hey, we're lifelong fans because we're both fans of a sport. But pro wrestling, it brings people together.
It does. And so talking about bringing people together, then I think the fascinating thing for me is what it's like to see it live, because I only, as by the time this goes out, people will know that I only went to see WWF once, being in the UK. It wasn't over all that often. But sort of, I often dream being in America, you got to see endless amount of shows, you know, if you were willing to travel so far. So, I mean, talk about, do you remember like the first time you saw it live or?
Well, I remember the first time I saw wrestling live, which was different than WWF. I didn't see WWF immediately. Our home territory was called Atlantic Grand Prix Wrestling, although when I got involved with it, it was called World Grand Prix Wrestling because they wanted to appear more national because they were competing with Coliseum home videos and stuff.
Sure.
And I remember my uncle and aunt took me, and I was so excited. And it was my first exposure to the card is subject to change because the promoted event was not what I saw. I was expecting a tag match main event with Leo Burke and the Cuban Assassin against the Spoiler and Nikita Karmlikov, but it wound up being two singles matches, and that was great. I loved it. It was very interesting to I think it was 6 or 7, because I remember them brawling up into the stands right around us, and that was fun. My first WWF show was a house show in Montreal. I was visiting family there when I was 10. This would have been in August of 1990, shortly before SummerSlam 90.
Okay.
And the thing that really stands out for me from that show, well, other than everything, because I remember every match, all the outcomes, it's crazy. Like I couldn't tell you what happened on WWE 3 years ago, or hell on Monday night, but I can tell you distinctly what happened in that show. And it included Axe and Crush against the Hart Foundation. It was during that era when I remember reading the arena reports in Pro Wrestling Illustrated, and in one show there may be Axe and Smash, another one Smash and Crush, but the rarest combination was Axe and Crush.
Yeah,
and that's what I saw.
That's cool. That's something worth noting. What did you think of Crush back then as Demolition?
I remember, well, the term smart mark certainly applied to me as a young boy. I think it was because of the magazines. They always made it seem like the NWA and AWA and Mid-South were superior to the more cartoonish WWF. So I always had that mentality. And I was a huge Demolition fan in 1989.
Yeah.
I remember whining like a little baby when Demolition were eliminated from their Survivor Series match at Survivor Series 89. And so I was a huge Demolition fan, but I was also a big Road Warriors fan from before that. Animal was the first ever wrestler I was for Halloween.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. With regards to Crush, I thought it changed something because it was not the first, but one of the first non-turns that I remember where there wasn't a single event that caused someone to go from babyface to heel or fan favorite to rule breaker. It just all of a sudden we were supposed to boo them. And I just thought Crush was just another guy. Yeah, he was bigger, but he didn't have the pedigree that Action Smash had. Also didn't have the support. Like
No.
years and years of being on TV that Axe and Smash had, whereas Crush was just sort of showed up one day,
Yeah.
and we were expected to care about him.
So I wasn't following wrestling at that point. It was more sort of 91, 92 that I got into it.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember the Kona version of Crush when he came in,
Yeah.
and I think it was the colours and that really grabbed me. I thought, this guy looks really cool. And, I remember cheering him on when he was meeting Shawn Michaels for the Intercontinental title. Looking back at it now, I can see there wasn't really much chance he was going to get over him then. But then he just went away to nothing, really. I think I've heard interviews about Bryan Adams since, and I think the consensus is he was quite green back then.
Yeah, well, it's so crazy to think about, because Demolition had appeared at WrestleMania 7 in March or April of 91, and then he comes back in early 92 or mid 92 as Kona Crush, same name, and they never acknowledged that it was Demolition. And wrestling fans are very forgiving. We'll just accept anything that you put in front of us. Like, yeah, sure.
Yeah, I was completely with that. It's like I never understood why they never made that connection. I remember SummerSlam 92 when they put him against Repo Man. It was like we're seeing Demolition against each other, and nobody's saying anything.
Demolition explodes.
And I was brought up to believe. My cousin, I think, made me believe a few odd things. Like he made me believe that the original Doink the Clown was Axe, was Bill Eadie. So when they got to WrestleMania 9, I was like, oh my God, he's doing it again. He's going up against Demolition again, but it wasn't, obviously. But so let's move on, because we did connect over one particular thing when I put a post out about this. And you were at a particular event in 95, which had something fairly notable on it. So sure.
Yeah, it was something that I didn't realize was notable at the time, and I didn't even realize it was notable shortly afterwards, because in Canada we didn't have Nitro Live until I want to say October or November of 97. So we would get Worldwide on Saturdays, which would usually be a week behind, and then there would be a section in Worldwide where they would have their WCW report, kind of like how Superstars would have the WF Magazine report with Mean Gene hosting. This was similar. It was Mean Gene, but with WCW. And they showed Lex Luger showing up on Nitro, and I thought, oh, wow, I just saw him live. And it was the last WF show that Luger was on. It was Lex and Shawn Michaels against Yokozuna and Owen Hart. That was our main event.
That's a very not unique necessarily, but it's a very interesting pairing, I think, Lex Luger and Shawn Michaels, because I could have imagined it back in 93. I think when around like WrestleMania 9, because they were both up against Mr. Perfect, I suppose, around that time. Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't have thought that they would put them together in 95. Was it a result of a card change, or
no? That was the announced match. I believe Davey Boy had turned heel not that long beforehand. And also with house shows, especially around that time, it seemed like it was very random as far as the matches. Like I remember just a couple of years later, it seemed that the big thing was when they announced triple threat matches were now a thing, and it could be any three guys, whether they had animosity with each other or not. It was just a match. And as a youngster, especially growing up in the 80s, I didn't mind that so much. I know a lot of modern fans need personal issues for matches. They have to have an angle or be involved in a feud. But when you're used to squash matches, whenever you would get like a Bad News Brown versus Hacksaw Jim Duggan or Ted DiBiase versus Jimmy Snuka, it didn't matter that there was no angle. It was like, wow, two name guys. Who knows who's going to win?
And this is my main experience with WWF, or my only experience, was a major event. I was at the one night only pay-per-view in 97. And my cousin was at SummerSlam 92. So we didn't get, I've not had an experience of a house show of the WWF, or WCW or anything. So it always intrigued me when I would pick up like some of the independent magazines over here and read some of the results, because they're matches you wouldn't necessarily see on TV. Certainly not.
Oh, that was the appeal.
Yeah.
Like I saw weird stuff like Mo versus Barry Horowitz or Terry Taylor versus Typhoon. And I love that, because you don't know who's going to win. Well, Mo and Barry Horowitz, he kind of did. But with stuff like Luger and Shawn against Owen and Yoko, I never had any preconceived notions that I was going to see a title change, because Owen and Yoko were the tag champs at the time. Yeah. But you didn't know how they were going to retain the titles, because usually heels didn't go over in the finish, but it was like a screw job DQ counted or something like that. But the one thing I really remember about that match, Luger gave Owen the customary 10 smashes to the turnbuckle with the holding the back of the head.
Yeah.
That spot that's kind of gone the way of the dodo bird in recent years, but it wasn't, they didn't just stop at 10, they went to 40. And I remember Yoko in the corner holding his mouth, busting a gut, because all the stories about Owen being a ribber, I mean, it was obvious right there in that match.
That's brilliant, isn't it? Because you hear about these as well at house shows, that they're in jokes with the guys in the ring. You know, they do things.
It's more loosey-goosey.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
I have been to see a televised show. My first one was last Valentine's. Well, not Valentine's of 2021, but Valentine's of 2020, right before the pandemic hit.
Mm-hmm.
And it was my first ever TV taping. It was a SmackDown along with 205 Live. And it was night and day different between the house shows. I much prefer the house shows because it's not as rigid. It's not as timed out. It's not as much downtime.
Yeah.
And I remember at the time thinking, I really want to see a pay-per-view, or I really want to see a TV taping. I wanted to see something that I could go back and look at it later on the network or on tape, and, you know, see a title change or see a big historical moment. But as I've gotten older, I realized that the house shows, you could tell the wrestlers had way more fun because they had more freedom.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's necessary. It's not something that's going to be broadcast, is it? You know, they can do these odd little things just for the people that are there. I think for Owen, being in his own in Canada, you know, he's taking one in his in his home country to, you know, just be the fall guy almost. But you can imagine him doing that. So
yeah, it was brilliant.
So have you been in? Did you grow up in Canada? Have you been there all your life, did you say? Yeah.
Yeah. I lived in St. John until I was 25. I moved out here to Vancouver 15 and a half years ago. I'm 40 now. And when I moved out here, I was able to see some ECCW, Elite Championship or Canadian Championship Wrestling, formerly WCCW, West Coast Championship Wrestling.
Okay.
A lot of big names have worked this territory. Brian Danielson, Becky Lynch as, I can't remember her old name, Rebecca Lynn or something like that.
Right.
And that was fun, seeing it in smaller venues and just being able to hear the wrestlers, see the action up close.
Up close. I was going to, obviously customary really, you're the first Canadian on my show, by the way. So thank you. But, you know, it's Hart country. Is it Hart country throughout the country in terms of wrestling, or are there other names up there that are sort of considered as good or better?
Well, there's a couple of different things. There's age range. There's also where you are in the country. Like where I come from, the big name was Leo Burke. Everyone of a certain age, when you would mention wrestling, they would talk about Leo Burke. It was kind of like the Hulk Hogan or Stone Cold or Rock or Cena internationally, but in that maritime area, Leo Burke was the guy. In Quebec, it would either be Dino Bravo, Mad Dog Vachon, the Rougeaus. In where I am now in Vancouver, whenever because I wear a lot of wrestling jackets, I wear it on my sleeve that I'm a wrestling fan.
Cool.
And whenever I run into somebody, they'll always mention Gene Kiniski. Like, I used to watch Gene Kiniski when I was a kid.
Wow.
With regards to Brett, yeah, everyone loves him. There are people that are a bit of contrarians, will make it so Brett's not their favorite, but nobody dislikes Brett. He's not someone that people are going to pick apart his work. The only thing that I typically see with regards to Brett, some people will say that he didn't have much of a character. But in Canada, the in-ring part of being a wrestler is very important. People care about that a lot more here. That's why guys that may not be the best on the stick are able to get over quite a bit here, because we don't care about the angles and the story as much as we do how well they are at being a wrestler. I
echo that, because I think for me the big turn, the first big emotional moment I think in my childhood was when Brett won the title in 92, because it changed. All of a sudden, you were off in another trajectory almost. You had the cartoonish, late 80s, early 90s with Hulk Hogan. Once he went, it looked like Vince was putting more faith, whether he wanted to or not, in the guys who were actually wrestlers, in my opinion.
And guys that were over. Like
yeah.
Brett was not somebody that long-term fans were going to poo-poo if he was given the title. And one of the big misnomers is that when Brett became the champion, they kind of had smaller guys. But if you think about it, Savage and Flair were the champions right before him, and they're all in the same division.
Yeah. And I think it got more interesting then, because I kind of liked, I backed the underdog, and a few times when, Brett was up against Razor Ramon or Yokozuna and that, he was the underdog against them, and it makes you root for him more. It's more believable.
Brett's my all-time favorite, and the thing I always love about him is it reminds me of how I feel about my sports teams. I'm a big Montreal Canadiens fan in hockey, a big St. Louis Cardinals fan in baseball, a big Minnesota Vikings fan in football, a big Atlanta Hawks fan in basketball. So with those sports, I'm not just rooting for a good match or a good sporting event. I'm rooting for my team to win. And with Brett, I felt that way. I didn't care whether or not it was a good match. It would be, because it was a Brett match, but I wanted him to win. And that's how I could tell he was my favorite wrestler. There were other wrestlers where I didn't care so much if they won or lost, as long as it was a really good match. With Brett, I didn't care if it was a really good match. I just wanted him to win. I wanted him to go over.
Yeah, and there's those occasions when he didn't. I think when he was up against, particularly Bob Backlund in Survivor Series '94, I was in shock with that, because firstly I was in shock that they would even put the title on Backlund. Really, I didn't make much sense. But
Backlund's heel turn in the summer of '94, my all-time favorite heel turn. I know a lot of people like the Hogan one. It was so unexpected, because I remember reading about Backlund in the magazines for years, and he was one of those guys like a Steamboat or a Tito that I thought would always be a babyface. And I just never pictured him being a heel. I just thought he was going to be a lower card, older babyface. And when they did that, I was quite surprised.
It was quite boring when he came back in '93 because there wasn't anything about his match. It was a really awkward style. It didn't gel with the guys you had around then. But then, the spark went off. Literally, he just went into overdrive, and I think that character was really good. Just didn't have enough life in it.
Well, that was on them. They really, if we really think about it, he should have lost the title at Rumble. He should have had a couple of months on TV with the title, and instead of just doing it at a house show, trying to do the Hulk Hogan thing again, like they tried and failed with Luger, with Diesel, it just didn't work. And that segues back actually to the particular event that we were talking about in '95. What was your opinion of '95 for the world of wrestling? I hated it. I absolutely hated it, because I was old enough to remember when it was good. It's kind of like right now when people talk about how wrestling's better than it ever has been. I'm thinking, I've seen the ratings. I know that that's not the case. I lived when there was a lot of opportunities. If somebody had gotten stale, they could just go to another territory and freshen them up all over again. Whereas now you have guys like Randy Orton who have been on TV since 2002, and there'll be countless guys that are sitting there in catering, and they'll say, creative has nothing for you, but they always have something for Randy Orton. He's always on the show, and it's like, I don't care.
Just doing the same thing. Yeah, he is. It's one of the reasons I don't tend to watch it really now. I'm very, very loyal to this particular era that I grew up with, because that's, emotionally that's what takes me back. And same as the guys who are growing up with it now probably have no recollection or no interest of what happened 20 years ago. But 95, I did a show on it earlier in the series, because that, to me, it's one that sticks in my mind for the right and wrong reasons, to be fair. The product was pretty dire.
Oh, it was awful. But 95 is a tale of 2 years in a way. You have pre-Nitro and you have post-Nitro.
Yeah.
And everything pre-Nitro was just the shits. Like, I right now I'm a bit of a retrophile. I'll watch older stuff. I'll watch World Class, Mid South, NWA, Old School WWF, and I'm dreading when I get to 95. I'll probably just say no thanks. I don't want to watch it. It's because I lived it. I was there. I remember it just being an imagination bankrupt. It was just completely.
To me,
Awful.
again, just one opinion, but I'm sure there's some out there that do agree with it. They were trying, the WWF anyway, were trying to build a company around the wrong person. You know, they had very miles, very few miles that he could have done. The fact that he made a year as champion, but it kind of, if you've got him at the top against the guys he was against, it's no secret really as to why Brett was stuck in the mid card until the end of the year.
Well, that's the thing. Like, they had the guy right there the entire time that they could have built the company around, and nobody who was watching at the time would have been upset about that. If you watch any of the pay-per-views or TV, Brett always got a big reaction from the fans. He was super over. And I remember talking with my buddies around the time in summer of 95, and we were talking about who are the most over faces in the company. And we were talking about being Brett, Shawn, Undertaker, and Razor. And Diesel was the champion at the time, and we didn't think that he was up there. And it was just the situation where WCW wasn't really putting much pressure on Vince to try anything new and different until Nitro. And that's when all of a sudden Diesel has his best match ever at Survivor Series 95, losing the title to Brett. And then all of a sudden what happens? He becomes super interesting by being a tweener.
Yeah,
and it was great.
He was the first one, which then I feel is one of the ones that paved the way for Stone Cold. So, you know, there weren't many of those, or I can't think of any. Really,
it was like
before.
You had a full year with this guy on top.
Yeah.
And you never once considered doing something interesting with him. You have him feuding with Sid, Mabel, and who cares? Like, his whole reign was just a whole who cares era. Especially when you had Brett and Shawn, guys like that, who were right there, way better than Diesel. And, you know, I mean, that's Vince for you. He likes the big guys.
He does, and he probably wasn't listening to the fans necessarily, you know. And he had the guys who were quite loyal, like you said, Brett and Shawn, who were willing to do whatever at that point.
Yeah, he wasn't listening to either of the fans that were still watching. Yeah.
So going back that show with Luger's last match, can you remember any of the other matches that you were subjected to?
There was Hakushi against 1-2-3 Kid. No, sorry, it was Duke the Dumpster Droese subbing for Kid. There was also Bertha Faye against Alundra Blaze. Gosh, I honestly can't remember much else on that card.
It's a bit of a SummerSlam rerun in places.
Yeah,
then, is it?
Yeah. Well, also it was my first exposure to a guy by the name of Isaac Yankem, because I didn't see SummerSlam. Okay. And this house show happened like a week or so after SummerSlam, and it was in the era when you'd wait until there was a Coliseum home video release to see the pay-per-view, and I don't think Yankem had been on TV yet, so it was my first time seeing him was live. That also happened a few years later with Mordecai.
Okay. Wow, that's a name that doesn't come up all that often.
No, and there's a reason for that.
I was going to say, when you were about to mention Hakushi and the 1-2-3 Kid, actually looking at SummerSlam, that was probably take Shawn and Razor out of the equation, I suppose, was probably the best match on the card to me. It was a good opener. It was, you know, the only one thing that got me interested in watching the rest of it.
Yeah, well, that was 95 in a nutshell. I mean, there's a few good workers sprinkled throughout the cards, but usually it was just a whole mess. Like, don't even get me started on King of the Ring. But the one we'd rather forget. Yeah, well, the thing is, in St. John, we were kind of like a seat town. Our arena could really only hold maybe 4,000 or 5,000 people, maybe 9,000. Tops. Like, I don't even think 9,000. So we would get a lot of the feuds that were kind of cold at that point. And Lex Luger was like our guy. I remember seeing him main event a show against Ludwig Borga and then against Crush, and then teaming up with Shawn against Yoko and Owen. So 3 straight shows where Luger was the headliner, and it turned out to be his last show. Was there any hint at that point that he was on his way out? No, he's like smiling and stuff. I remember he seemed to be having a good time, and I remember thinking that was a really good match, because the past few house shows that I had been to, the matches were either short or very safe. Like, nobody wanted to get hurt for, you know, a few hundred people. Listen, mate, thank you so much
for coming on and talking about this. I think I can probably have you back to delve into something else at some point.
Oh, I could talk about wrestling all day, every day.
That sounds good. No, I can probably, you know, I'll pick apart. I want to do some episodes where I either look at an event with someone, not necessarily watch it or whatever, but just dissect it. Because I've done a few of these on my own. It's great putting my opinion out there, but it's nice to have, some more to bounce off of. So I'll be interested if you're interested.
Oh, I'm a man on the internet. I have opinions.
Brilliant. Cool. Listen, thank you so much.
Okay, well, pip and all that. Cheerio, governor.
Thank you, mate. Thanks again. I'll speak to you soon.
You got it.
Cheers, mate.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to a Nerd to Know Media production.